Hi, very glad to see you on the channel. Before you start listening to the story, write in the comments whether you like the voice on the video. The ocean breeze rolled in from the shore, carrying the scent of salt and sun-warmed sand through the open windows of our bungalow. The soft sound of waves crashing in the distance was familiar, grounding. I had built a life here with Emily, a life that was supposed to be steady, honest, and real. I stepped onto the porch, beer in hand, watching the late afternoon light stretch long shadows across the street. It was quiet, the kind of quiet I had always liked. This town had a rhythm to it. Mornings spent with coffee on the deck, afternoons filled with the hum of the classroom, evenings winding down as the sky melted into shades of pink and orange. While you're here, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to know. But lately, that rhythm had been off. Emily's car wasn't in the driveway. Again, I checked the time. Nearly 7. She had told me she'd be back by 6. I leaned against the railing, taking a slow sip. Late showings, she had said. More clients, more listings. The market was booming, and she was taking advantage of every opportunity. I had believed her the first few times. Now, I wasn't so sure. The front door finally swung open just past 8. Emily stepped inside, dropping her purse onto the entryway table, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She was dressed sharp, black slacks, fitted blazer, the kind of outfit that belonged in a high-rise office, not a small coastal real estate firm. Busy day, I asked, keeping my voice even. She glanced up, as if only just realizing I was there. Yeah, totally crazy. 2 buyers backed out last minute, and then one of my clients wouldn't stop asking about property lines. She let out a tired laugh, kicking off her heels. I swear, people think they're surveyors now just because they have Google Maps. I nodded, watching her carefully. Something was different. The way she smoothed down her blazer. The way she avoided looking directly at me. Then I caught it, subtle but there. A scent that didn't belong. Cologne. Not mine. Emily stepped closer, pressing a quick kiss to my cheek before heading toward the kitchen. You ate already? I let her move past me, studying the way she carried herself. Yeah. She opened the fridge, grabbing a bottle of water. Sorry I got back so late. I barely had time to grab lunch, let alone dinner. I stayed where I was. You could have called. She hesitated for half a second before twisting off the cap. I know. My phone was on silent. You know how it is when I'm with clients. Another easy excuse. I let the silence stretch, waiting to see if she'd fill it. She didn't. Instead, she leaned against the counter, taking a sip of water, eyes flicking to her phone. Rachel came by the next afternoon. She let herself in, same as always, setting a dish of homemade pasta on the counter. Figured you could use a break from cooking. I smiled, grateful. Rachel was one of the few people I trusted without question. She had been Emily's best friend since childhood, but she had never hesitated to call her out when necessary. She studied me for a moment, then asked, "Emily home?" I shook my head. Late showings again. Rachel set down her purse, crossing her arms. A lot of those lately. I met her gaze. Yeah. She hesitated. Something's been off. I exhaled slowly. You see it too. Rachel nodded, leaning against the counter. I asked her if she wanted to grab coffee yesterday. She got weird about it. Said she was busy, but wouldn't say with what. That didn't surprise me. Rachel sighed, watching me carefully. Look, if something's going on, you need to find out. I nodded, jaw tightening. I will. Rachel didn't press. She didn't need to. The doubt had already taken root. And I wasn't the kind of man who ignored the obvious. I had never been the kind of man to let doubt take over. You either trusted someone, or you didn't. And if you started questioning that trust, you had 2 choices: get to the truth, or let the lies swallow you whole. Emily was giving me reasons to question. So I started paying closer attention. The first receipt wasn't hard to find. I wasn't looking for it, but there it was, half crumpled on the kitchen counter, tucked between a stack of unopened mail. A dinner receipt from a high-end seafood restaurant downtown. 2 entrees. 2 cocktails. Signed with Emily's name. I turned it over in my hand, studying the details. She had told me she grabbed a quick bite between showings. This wasn't quick. This was planned. She came home late again that night. I waited in the living room, the TV on low, pretending to scroll through my phone. The door opened, and she stepped inside, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She paused when she saw me. "You're up." I glanced at the time. "It's almost 10. She let out a small laugh, setting her purse down. "Yeah, long day." Showed some vacation homes to a couple from out of state. They asked a million questions. I nodded, standing slowly. "Funny. Didn't realize out-of-state buyers liked fancy seafood." Emily's expression flickered for half a second before she masked it. "What?" I held up the receipt. This was sitting on the counter. Her gaze dropped to the paper. She hesitated, just long enough for me to know she was forming a lie. Then she let out an easy breath. "Oh, that." One of my clients wanted to discuss properties over dinner. He insisted on covering part of the bill, so I just signed my name to make it easier for accounting. I watched her. "Which client?" She waved a hand. "You don't know him. He's new. Try me." She blinked, then laughed again, this time forced. "God, Luke, you're acting like I did something wrong. It was just business." I didn't take my eyes off her. "If it's just business, you won't mind if I check in with your boss." Her posture stiffened. "Are you serious?" I slipped the receipt into my pocket. "Completely." Emily scoffed, shaking her head. "You're being ridiculous." I let the silence stretch. She picked up her purse and walked past me toward the bedroom without another word. Rachel came over the next morning, coffee in hand. She dropped into the chair across from me at the dining table, watching me carefully. "She's lying, isn't she?" I took a slow sip, nodding once. Rachel exhaled, setting down her drink. "I tried to meet up with her yesterday. She blew me off. Said she was swamped." I raised a brow. "Too busy for her best friend?" Rachel's jaw tightened. "That's not like her." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "You said something fell off last week. You still feel that way?" She nodded without hesitation. "More than ever." I studied her for a moment. Rachel had always been straightforward, the kind of person who didn't tiptoe around the truth. If she was uneasy, there was a reason. She leaned forward. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I think we should start paying closer attention." That was interesting." I nodded. "What are you thinking?" Rachel hesitated, then set her coffee down. "Emily told me she was working with a new set of clients. Some investment group looking to buy rental properties." I frowned. "She told me they were out-of-state retirees." Rachel's eyes met mine. Two completely different stories. "Luke," she said slowly, "I think we've got a problem." I exhaled through my nose, standing up. "No." "She does." Rachel's expression hardened. "So what do we do?" I picked up the receipt again, rolling it between my fingers. "We stopped trusting her words." Rachel nodded. "Then we start with finding out exactly who she's been having dinner with." I tapped the receipt against the table once before slipping it back into my pocket. Emily thought she was being careful. She wasn't, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Rachel never believed in coincidences. Life had a way of throwing people exactly where they needed to be, exactly when they needed to be there. That was how she found herself standing in the sleek, modern entryway of the waterfront restaurant, waiting for her takeout order, when she saw something that made her grip tighten around her phone. Emily, not alone. She was seated near the window, across from a man Rachel recognized from social media. Brandon, one of her co-workers at the real estate office. He was leaning in close, his hand resting on hers, his thumb stroking slow circles against her skin. Rachel took a careful step back, slipping out of sight behind a decorative plant. She could have left, could have pretended she hadn't seen anything, but she stayed. She watched as Emily laughed at something Brandon said, tilting her head in that familiar, practiced way, the same way she used to do with Luke. She watched as Emily leaned across the table, lowering her voice, her fingers trailing up Brandon's forearm. Rachel's stomach twisted. She knew what she was seeing. Then Brandon reached up, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's cheek. Rachel sucked in a sharp breath as Emily closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. The final confirmation came seconds later, when Brandon cupped the side of her face, tilting her chin up, and kissed her. Rachel turned on her heel and walked straight out of the restaurant. The drive home blurred together. Her hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, her pulse hammering as her mind spun in a dozen directions at once. She could still see it, burned into her memory. Emily's lips pressed against another man's, the way her body had angled toward him, completely unguarded. This wasn't business. This wasn't some harmless misunderstanding. This was betrayal. Rachel pulled into her driveway, cutting the engine. She sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady her breathing. Then she picked up her phone and dialed Luke. Luke answered on the second ring. "Hey." Rachel swallowed hard. "Are you home?" There was a slight pause. "Yeah. What's wrong?" She hesitated, pressing her forehead against the steering wheel. This was going to break him, but keeping it from him would be worse. "Rachel." She lifted her head, voice firm. "I need to come over." Luke opened the door the moment she stepped onto the porch. His expression was unreadable, but the way he stood, shoulders squared, arms crossed, told her he already knew something was off. Rachel stepped inside without a word, pacing the length of the living room before turning to face him. "I saw Emily," she said, voice tight. Luke didn't react. "Where?" Rachel met his eyes. "Waterfront Grill." Something flickered across his face. Was she alone? Rachel clenched her jaw. No, the silence stretched. Luke inhaled slowly, then exhaled. "Who?" Rachel hesitated. Then, finally, she said, "Brandon." Luke nodded once, like he had already suspected it. Rachel studied him, waiting for anger, for some sign of hurt. But his face remained unreadable. "I saw them together," she continued, forcing herself to say it. "Holding hands. Kissing." Luke sat down on the couch, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "How long were you there?" Rachel swallowed. "Long enough." Silence. Luke finally looked at her. "Thank you for telling me." Rachel let out a breath, shaking her head. "I hate that I had to." Luke leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. She really thought she could get away with this. Rachel crossed her arms. "What are you going to do?" Luke sat up slowly, expression darkening. "I'm going to make sure she regrets it." The coffee shop smelled of fresh-baked pastries and espresso, but neither of us was here for breakfast. I sat across from Rachel at a small corner table, watching as she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup like she was holding onto something steady. She had been the one to call me early this morning. There was an edge to her voice, something unspoken sitting between the words. I didn't ask what was wrong over the phone. I already knew. Now, she was here, sitting across from me, trying to figure out how to say it. She took a slow breath. "Luke, I have to tell you something, and it isn't good." I waited, my grip tightening slightly around my own coffee. "Go on." Rachel hesitated, eyes flicking toward the window, as if debating whether to say it out loud. Then, finally, she met my gaze and said, "It's Emily." I didn't move. "What about her?" Rachel swallowed hard. "She's cheating." I saw it with my own eyes. The words didn't surprise me. They didn't hit like a punch or send a shock wave through my body. They just settled, confirming what I had already started to suspect. "Still, I asked who." Rachel exhaled sharply. "Brandon, the guy from her office." That name wasn't new to me. I had heard it before in casual conversation, Emily mentioning him in passing, laughing at some inside joke I wasn't part of. I had noticed the way she said his name. Not guilty, not obvious, just different. I leaned forward. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Rachel set her coffee down, fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I was picking up dinner last night. Waterfront Grill. I saw Emily sitting at a table near the window. Brandon was with her." She hesitated, then continued. "They were close. Too close." She was touching his arm, laughing at everything he said. He had his hand over hers like it was the most natural thing in the world. I stayed silent, letting her finish. Then he reached up, brushed her hair back, and kissed her. Rachel's voice hardened, and she let him. I nodded once, slowly. Rachel studied me carefully. "Luke, are you okay?" I met her eyes, letting a moment stretch between us before answering. "I will be." She let out a breath. "You don't look surprised." "I'm not." Her brow furrowed. "You knew." I suspected, I admitted. The late nights, the stories that didn't line up, the damn cologne I kept smelling when she got home. I shook my head. But suspicion isn't proof. And Emily's good at making excuses. Rachel exhaled, sitting back. "I hate that I had to be the one to tell you." I tapped my fingers against my cup. "I'd rather hear it from you than let her lie to my face a second longer." She nodded, watching me carefully. "So what now?" I leaned forward, voice steady. "We make sure she doesn't get away with it." Rachel studied me, then gave a sharp nod. I'm in. I raised an eyebrow. Didn't even hesitate. She lied to you. She lied to me, Rachel said, shaking her head. She deserves whatever's coming. I smirked slightly. Then let's make sure it's something she won't forget. Rachel leaned forward. What are you thinking? I picked up my phone, tapping on the screen. We gather proof. We track her movements. We make sure, when the time comes, she has no room left to twist the truth. Rachel narrowed her eyes, nodding. She won't see it coming. I exhaled, rolling my shoulders. She has no idea. And with that, the game had changed. I had never been the kind of man to act without thinking. Some people let their anger drive them, rushing into confrontation, demanding answers. But I wasn't going to give Emily the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. I was going to be patient. And when the time was right, I was going to make sure she lost everything. Rachel sat across from me at the kitchen table, laptop open, phone records pulled up on the screen. She had spent the last hour combing through Emily's statements, cross-referencing call logs, and timestamps. She exhaled sharply, tapping a name on the screen. Brandon. I leaned over, reading the details. Late-night calls. Repeated numbers. Patterns forming right in front of us. She's been talking to him almost every night, Rachel said. Sometimes for over an hour. I nodded. When I was asleep, Rachel clicked on another tab. And check this out. Hotel charges. Nothing crazy, but she's been paying for rooms. Small boutique places. Not exactly work trips. I sat back, crossing my arms. She really thought she was covering her tracks. Rachel let out a bitter laugh. She wasn't even trying that hard. I took a deep breath, exhaling through my nose. All right, we have enough to know what's going on. Now we need to catch them in the act. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Ow! I smirked. We set the bait. Rachel had always been well-connected. She knew everyone in town, from business owners to bar regulars to the people who organized weekend bonfires by the beach. When I told her the plan, she was already making calls, setting the pieces into place. By the time we were done, the trap was set. A beach party. Nothing too elaborate. Just a casual gathering of familiar faces, drinks, music, a fire pit glowing under the night sky. The kind of event Emily would never turn down. The invitation would come from one of Rachel's friends, someone Emily trusted. And with the way she had been sneaking around, there was no way she would show up alone. She would bring Brandon. And when she did, she would have nowhere to hide. The next morning, Rachel took the plan one step further. She walked straight into the real estate office. She had an excuse lined up, pretending to be an interested buyer looking for a new property, acting casual, asking questions. But she wasn't there for listings. She was watching. And within 15 minutes, she got exactly what we needed. Emily and Brandon, slipping out the back door together. Rachel didn't hesitate. She snapped 2 photos before they disappeared down the alley, walking toward Brandon's car. When she sent them to me, the caption was simple, lunch break. I stared at the images, jaw tightening. Emily, standing too close to him, her hand brushing against his arm. His smirk, the easy confidence of a man who thought he had no reason to be careful. They had no idea their time was running out. I texted Rachel back. Perfect. Now we wait. She responded a second later. Not for long. The beach party was in 2 days. Emily and Brandon had no idea that by the end of it, their little secret wouldn't be a secret anymore. The setup was flawless. Rachel and I'd spent the last 2 days making sure everything fell into place. We spread the word about an end-of-summer celebration, making it sound like the kind of event no one would want to miss. A friend of Rachel's had offered up his beach house for the night, complete with a bonfire, drinks, and enough people to make it feel real. Emily had no idea the entire thing was built just for her downfall. I stood by the bar, drink in hand, scanning the crowd. People moved easily between the bonfire and the house, laughter carrying over the sound of the waves. The glow of string lights gave the beach an almost dreamlike quality, shadows flickering over the sand. Then I saw her. Emily had just arrived, dressed in a flowing sundress, her hair loose in the breeze. She smiled, laughing at something Rachel said as they walked toward the fire. And right behind her, trying to stay casual, was Brandon. He had come separately, of course. They were careful enough for that. but I had no doubt he was here for one reason only. I turned my head slightly. Rachel caught my eye from across the party and gave the smallest nod. The trap was set. An hour passed, then another. The drinks flowed, the music hummed in the background, and people danced by the water's edge. Emily had been drifting between conversations, keeping up the act, pretending nothing was out of the ordinary. But I saw the way she kept glancing toward the dunes, the way her fingers twitched against her glass. She was waiting for something, or someone. I moved closer, slipping through the crowd, my focus narrowing. Then, just as I expected, Emily set her drink down and murmured something to Rachel before stepping away from the fire, weaving her way toward the dunes. Rachel turned toward me, voice low. "Here we go." I didn't respond. I just followed. Emily thought she was being discreet. She walked along the beach, the waves just barely touching her toes, glancing over her shoulder once before continuing toward the darker part of the dunes. Brandon was already waiting. He leaned against a wooden fence post, hands in his pockets, a smirk playing on his lips as she approached. "Took you long enough." Emily laughed, brushing a hand through her hair. "I couldn't just disappear all at once." He tilted his head. "And now?" She stepped closer, reaching up to rest her hands on his chest. "Now we have a little time." I felt Rachel shift beside me, phone raised, camera lens catching everything. Brandon dipped his head, lips brushing Emily's ear. "You know, it's risky meeting like this." Emily hummed. "That's what makes it fun." Rachel exhaled softly, her grip steady on the phone. Then, before either of them could realize they were being watched, Brandon kissed her. Rachel tapped the screen, capturing the moment. Proof. Undeniable, irrefutable proof. The game was over. Now, all that was left was the final move. The ocean breeze rolled in, carrying the distant sounds of laughter and music from the party. But I only had eyes on one thing. Emily and Brandon, wrapped up in their stolen moment, believing they were untouchable. Rachel lowered her phone, the last video saved. She turned to me, eyes sharp. "It's time." I nodded once, stepping out of the shadows. Emily was still whispering something against Brandon's lips when she caught movement from the corner of her eye. She turned, her body stiffening the second she saw me. Brandon noticed too. His shoulders tensed, eyes flicking between us like he was piecing together a bad situation too late. I walked forward slowly, deliberately, the sand shifting under my boots. I could hear Rachel just behind me, her phone raised, still recording. Emily let out a forced laugh, taking a step back. "Luke." I pulled out my phone and hit play. The video lit up the screen. Her, Brandon, their hands tangled together. The way she leaned into him, the way his lips pressed against hers. The same scene that had played out right in front of me just moments ago. But now, the sound carried over the dunes, and people were starting to turn. Laughter faded near the bonfire. Heads swiveled. Conversations died down as the glow of my phone's screen flickered against the night. Emily's face drained of color. "Luke, what are you doing?" I lifted my gaze. "Showing them who you really are." Brandon took a half step back, muttering something under his breath. He wasn't stupid. He knew what this meant. Emily's hands flew up. "This isn't." Rachel's voice cut through the night, calm and cold. "Don't say it's not what it looks like." Emily spun toward her, something frantic in her eyes. "Rachel." Rachel crossed her arms. "You did this to yourself." A murmur rippled through the crowd. More people had gathered now, drawn by the tension, watching the scene unfold like something out of a bad movie. Emily turned back to me, voice shaking. "Luke, please, this is a misunderstanding." I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. "No, Emily, this is betrayal." I pulled another paper from my pocket, the receipts, the call logs, the records Rachel and I had pieced together over the last few weeks. I held them up. "Want to explain these?" Emily's mouth opened, but no words came out. I took another step forward, lowering my voice just enough so only she could hear. "You thought you were so careful." Her chest rose and fell too quickly. You thought I wouldn't notice." She blinked rapidly. "Luke, just let me." I tilted my head. "Let you what?" "Lie again." Brandon shifted uncomfortably. "Look, man, I didn't know." I turned on him. "You didn't know she was married?" Brandon hesitated. Emily's head snapped toward him. Brandon, don't. His expression twisted. You said things were complicated. I let out a dry laugh. Yeah, I bet she did. Emily reached for me, desperation in her eyes. Look, we can fix this. I stepped back. No, you don't get to talk your way out of this. The weight of her failure, finally, seemed to hit her. Her shoulders sagged, her gaze flicking to the crowd behind me. People were still watching, whispering, judging. Rachel's voice came again, quiet but firm. You lost, Emily. Emily turned away, pressing a hand to her forehead like she could block it all out. But it was too late. Her life, the one she had spent months trying to balance between lies, had just crumbled in front of everyone. I let the silence stretch for a long moment before exhaling slowly. Pack your things, Emily. Then I turned, walking away, leaving her standing in the wreckage of her choices. The fallout came fast. By the time I got home that night, I had already made peace with my decision. Emily was done. She had lost, and there was no coming back from this. I sat in the living room, waiting. The only sound was the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. The house, our house, felt different now. Colder, emptier. Then, the front door creaked open. Emily stepped inside hesitantly, her usual confidence stripped away. She looked smaller somehow, shoulders drawn inward, eyes darting toward me like she wasn't sure if she was about to get screamed at or thrown out on the spot. I wasn't going to give her either. I just gestured toward the table. Seat. She swallowed, hesitating before lowering herself into the chair across from me. Luke, I held up a hand. Don't. She clamped her mouth shut. I reached for the envelope sitting on the table and slid it toward her. Divorce papers. Her breath hitched. Wait, read them. She picked up the envelope with shaky hands, fingers trembling as she pulled out the documents. Her eyes scanned the first page, then the second, before flicking up to meet mine. She was panicked now. You already filed this? I nodded. A week ago. Her lips parted slightly, like she was processing just how thoroughly I had planned for this. You knew. I leaned back. I knew enough. Her gaze flickered down to the documents again, searching for something, anything, that might give her a way out. Then she paused. Her breath came quicker. The beach house belongs to me. I cut in. She swallowed hard. No. I tapped the paper in front of her. The deed is in my name. Always was. My family trust covers the property. You have no claim to it. The blood drained from her face. I watched as the reality set in. Not only was she losing me, but she was losing the house, the place she had entertained Brandon, the place she had probably imagined walking away from this with. She had nothing. I let the silence stretch, letting it sink in. Then I spoke again, voice calm. You'll leave with whatever you came with. That's all. She clenched her jaw. You're punishing me. No, Emily. I'm giving you exactly what you earned. Her hands balled into fists, but she had nothing left to fight with. She tried again, voice quieter. Luke, please. I know I messed up, but we were happy once, weren't we? I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. That doesn't matter anymore. Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't for me. They were for herself. I stood, pushing back my chair. You have until the weekend to pack your things. Emily stared at me, like she still couldn't believe it had come to this. I didn't wait for her to speak again. I turned and walked upstairs, leaving her sitting there with nothing but her mistakes. The next morning, Rachel showed up on my doorstep. She didn't say anything at first, just handed me a coffee and leaned against the railing of the porch. She's still here? She finally asked. I nodded. For now. Rachel exhaled, watching the waves in the distance. You okay? I took a sip of coffee. Yeah. Rachel turned her head slightly, studying me. You don't have to be. I smirked. I know. She nodded, accepting that. Brandon's not doing much better, by the way. I raised an eyebrow. Oh. Rachel pulled out her phone and scrolled for a second before holding it up. A screenshot from a local real estate forum, threads filled with rumors, accusations. Brandon's name wasn't just attached to Emily's mess anymore. His deals were falling through. Clients were backing out. The image he had worked so hard to build, charming, successful, untouchable, was starting to crack. He lost 2 major clients already, Rachel said. Word spreads fast. I nodded once. Good. Rachel smirked. Knew you'd like that. I took another sip of coffee, watching as the sun climbed higher over the water. Emily thought she had options. Now, she had nothing, and I was finally free. Emily stood in the living room, arms crossed, her expression flickering between defiance and desperation. The last of her things were packed, a couple of suitcases, a box of personal belongings. Nothing more. She had stalled for hours, avoiding the inevitable, but I wasn't giving her any more time. I leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, watching as she finally picked up her bags. It's time to go. She turned, eyes searching mine. You don't have to do this. I exhaled through my nose, shaking my head. You still think you get a say in this? Her jaw tightened. Luke, we were together for years. Doesn't that mean anything to you? I stared at her, voice flat. It meant something until you threw it away. She swallowed hard. I was confused. No, I cut in. You were selfish. She flinched, but I wasn't done. You lied. You snuck around. You thought you could have everything, that I'd never figure it out. You don't get to stand here and act like a victim. Her hands trembled at her sides. I never thought we'd end like this. I tilted my head. You didn't think at all. She blinked rapidly, struggling to hold back the tears threatening to spill over. Brandon, I let out a dry chuckle, is already gone, isn't he? Her silence was the only answer I needed. Brandon had never been in this for the long haul. He had enjoyed the thrill, the secrecy, the stolen moments. But now that her reputation was in ruins, now that there was nothing left to hide behind, he had moved on without hesitation. Emily let out a slow breath. I have nowhere to go. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door. That's not my problem. Her chin lifted slightly, as if she was trying to salvage some dignity. Without another word, she grabbed her bags and walked out. I didn't watch her leave. I just shut the door behind her. The weeks that followed were quieter. The house felt lighter, like it had been purged of something toxic. Emily had tried reaching out a few times. Calls I didn't answer, messages I didn't read. I had nothing left to say to her. What surprised me, though, was how often Rachel was around. At first, it was simple, checking in, making sure I was okay. Bringing over dinner when she knew I wouldn't bother cooking for myself. Inviting me out when I spent too much time alone. Then, without either of us realizing, it became something else. A late-night conversation on the porch that stretched until sunrise. A casual touch that lingered longer than expected. The way her laughter filled the space Emily had once occupied, but in a way that felt real. One evening, we sat by the fire pit, watching the waves roll in, the flames flickering between us. Rachel glanced at me, her voice softer than usual. Do you ever think about what's next? I considered that for a moment, then nodded. Yeah. She hesitated, and I turned my head, meeting her gaze. I think I like where it's going. She held my stare, something unspoken passing between us. Then, slowly, she leaned in. I met her halfway. The kiss was gentle, unhurried, a quiet acknowledgement that something new had begun, something built on trust, something real. Emily drifted from one rental to another, never staying in one place too long. She had lost everything, her home, her reputation, her security. She was no longer the woman who had once stood on the shore with the world at her feet. She was just another stranger now. And as Rachel and I walked along the beach, our hands brushing before intertwining, I realized something. Some betrayals break you, but some set you free. Thank you for listening to the end. I hope you enjoyed it very much. Don't forget to give a like and tell us in the comments what you would do in such a situation.